It was a foggy morning in San Francisco. People went to work. Kids walked to school. The air felt damp but clean, like any other September day in 1950. What no one knew was that the fog wasn't just fog. For 6 days, the US military quietly sprayed bacteria into the air, not over an enemy battlefield, but over American neighborhoods. The goal? To simulate a biological attack. The subjects? Nearly 1 million unknowing civilians. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a classified operation, a real experiment, and at least one man died because of it. This is the story of Operation Sea Spray, a forgotten chapter in American history where trust, consent, and public safety were sacrificed for data. To understand how this happened and why it matters even now, we need to go back to the Cold War and a boat anchored off the California coast. The year was 1950. World War II was over, but the Cold War was just beginning. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb the year before, and America's sense of invincibility was fading. A new kind of fear was spreading, not of bullets or tanks, but of germs. Biological warfare. Invisible, unpredictable, and terrifying. The US military, obsessed with staying ahead, launched a series of programs to understand how biological weapons might be used and how they might spread through cities if deployed by an enemy. But rather than use computer models or contain simulations, they wanted real-world data. Data from actual cities with real people. To them, San Francisco was the perfect test site. It had a large, dense population, tall buildings, predictable wind patterns, and perhaps most importantly, a layer of fog that rolled in almost daily, perfect for hiding things. There were no meetings with the mayor, no public announcements, no warnings. This was an era where government secrecy was standard. People trusted authority. They didn't question what they couldn't see, especially if it came from a uniform. In the eyes of military planners, the public didn't need to know. It was better if they didn't. Because in their minds, the risk was minimal and the data would be priceless. So they moved forward. They loaded a Navy ship with spray tanks. They filled them with bacteria, and under the cover of fog, they sailed just off the coast and began to release clouds of microbes into the wind. What they didn't know or didn't want to admit was that even harmless bacteria can become deadly when released into the lungs of vulnerable people, especially in hospitals, especially in those already sick. What happened next would change lives and end at least one of them. But no one would connect the dots, not for decades. It began quietly. Like most operations built on secrecy, it wasn't announced, debated, or questioned. It just happened. Between September 20th and 27th, 1950, a U.S. Navy ship, the USS George Eastman, stationed just off the coast of San Francisco, carried out one of the most brazen domestic military experiments in American history. Its mission? To spray the city with clouds of bacteria. From the ship's tanks, the crew released Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii, microorganisms believed to be harmless simulants. The goal was to mimic how a biological weapon might spread through an American city if the Soviets ever launched a germ attack. This was not theoretical, it was a live test. And San Francisco, with its 1 million residents, became a giant petri dish. The bacteria, invisible to the naked eye, drifted in the wind, carried inland by the city's iconic fog. It moved through downtown streets, over homes, into hospitals and schools. No one knew. The military tracked it carefully. They placed monitoring equipment in dozens of locations, on rooftops, street corners, phone booths. They collected samples from air vents and building interiors. Each sample helped them build a map of how fast, how far, and how effectively the bacteria could travel. And what they found was exactly what they hoped for. Within hours, the bacteria had spread across most of San Francisco. The military concluded that, had this been a real attack using a deadly pathogen, the city would have been crippled. From a tactical standpoint, Operation Sea Spray was a success. From a human standpoint, it was something else entirely. Just days after the test, doctors at Stanford University Hospital began noticing something strange. Patients were coming in with rare, serious infections. One man in particular, a 75-year-old named Edward J. Nevin, had recently undergone prostate surgery. He developed a deep, drug-resistant infection in his heart lining. The bacteria that caused it? Serratia marcescens, the exact strain the military had just sprayed over the city. He died a few weeks later. In the following months, 10 other patients at the same hospital developed Serratia infections, a bacteria that had never before been reported in that hospital. Coincidence? The military said yes. They denied any connection between the tests and the infections. Even though the timeline matched, the geography matched, and the bacteria matched. They claimed Serratia was naturally occurring and insisted the strain used was harmless. But years later, researchers would confirm that Serratia marcescens can cause serious, sometimes fatal infections, especially in people with weakened immune systems. It's now known to be a potential cause of urinary tract infections, respiratory illnesses, and endocarditis. Back in 1950, none of that was public knowledge. Nevin's family never received an explanation. They didn't know he had been caught in the middle of a secret military test. They just knew that he went into the hospital to recover and never came home. They weren't alone. Operation Sea Spray was just one of hundreds of similar tests carried out by the US military during the Cold War. In New York City, bacteria were released in subway tunnels. In Washington, D.C., they were sprayed from rooftops. In St. Louis, a mysterious powder was sprayed over poor, mostly black neighborhoods. Again, without consent and without any warning. Each time, the justification was the same. We needed to understand how a biological attack would work in case it ever happened. But the methods raised disturbing questions. Who gets to decide what risks are acceptable? When does national security override basic human rights? And how do you measure consent when no one knows they're being used? For decades, the tests remained classified. It wasn't until the 1970s, after a series of congressional investigations into unethical government experiments, including MKUltra and Tuskegee, that the truth started to surface. In 1976, documents about Operation Sea Spray were declassified. The Nevin family, stunned by what they read, demanded answers. They filed a lawsuit against the US government for wrongful death. The government denied liability. The court sided with them. The family received nothing. And Edward Nevin's death, still not officially acknowledged as part of the experiment. In later interviews, military officials admitted that they had no way of tracking long-term health effects. They didn't monitor the population. They didn't follow up with hospitals. They didn't warn local doctors to watch for symptoms. Because to them, this wasn't a human test. It was a dispersal pattern study, a technical exercise. What they didn't see, or didn't care to see, was that behind every data point was a person who breathed in the air, who got sick, who may have died. Even now, the full impact of Operation Sea Spray is unknown. No comprehensive health study was ever done. No public compensation ever issued. For many, the incident is still unknown, a ghost buried in classified archives and forgotten obituaries. But its legacy lives on. Serratia infections are now recognized as dangerous, and the ethics of human experimentation, particularly without informed consent, have become a central issue in medical and military research. Operation Sea Spray remains one of the clearest examples of what can happen when government secrecy meets scientific ambition, and no one is watching. But the fallout from Sea Spray wasn't just physical. It left behind something far more lasting, a question that still haunts us. What are we willing to sacrifice in the name of safety? Operation Sea Spray didn't cause a mass outbreak. It didn't wipe out a city or make the news in 1950. That's what made it so dangerous, because no one noticed, and that silence became its legacy. It wasn't until more than 20 years later, in the 1970s, that the American public learned what had happened. When congressional hearings uncovered the military's secret biological tests on civilians, people were stunned and then deeply shaken. Here was proof, on paper, that the US government had deliberately exposed hundreds of thousands of citizens to live bacteria without their knowledge or consent. People began to question what else had been done without their permission. The fallout went beyond physical illness. It cracked the foundation of public trust in science, in the military, in government agencies that claimed to protect. It forced lawmakers to confront a hard truth: that scientific progress and national defense must never come at the expense of human dignity. From this reckoning came new regulations, tighter oversight of human experimentation, mandatory informed consent in all federally funded research, the establishment of institutional review boards, IRBs, to monitor ethical standards. But none of that helped the people affected in 1950. No public compensation was given. No official apology was made. The family of Edward Nevin, the man who died, never saw justice. His death remains, even now, listed as a coincidence. And yet, the ethical stain lingers. Operation Sea Spray is taught today in universities, not as a scientific achievement, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when people are treated as statistics, of how quickly principles can be suspended when fear takes over. It reminds us that just because a test didn't kill thousands doesn't mean it was harmless. Sometimes the most lasting damage is done quietly, in the erosion of trust, in the rewriting of truth, and in the normalization of silence. So when the truth finally came out, decades later, there was only one question left. If they did it once, how many other times did we never hear about? Edward Nevin died alone in a hospital bed, his doctors confused, his family heartbroken. They never suspected the US military had sprayed bacteria over his city just days before. They were never warned, never asked, never told the truth. And when the government finally admitted what it had done, decades later, no one was held accountable. No apology was made. The silence was as deliberate as the test itself. Operation Sea Spray reminds us that dark history isn't always buried under war or written in blood. Sometimes it floats silently in the air, unseen, unspoken, and unpunished. If this story unsettled you, it should, because it wasn't science fiction. It happened, and we still don't know how many other experiments we never heard about. Thanks for listening to Dark History. If this moved you, share the story, because truth, once uncovered, shouldn't go back into the fog.